London in the 18th century was not yet the confident world city it would become, but a restless organism learning how to control its own weight. It sprawled rather than stood, stretching along the Thames like a creature that had grown faster than its bones could support. Each winter morning began not with bells or clocks or the measured voice of authority, but with the river itself. The River Thames was the city's first road, its first market, its first border, and in many ways its first memory. Before stone embankments disciplined its edges, before bridges multiplied and narrowed its view of the sky, the river shaped the habits of the city's body and the thinking of its people. At dawn, fog rolled low across the water, thick enough to erase the line between land and sky. It moved slowly, curling around hulls and pilings, swallowing sound until even the groan of wood against wood seemed distant and unreal. Masts emerged first, tall and skeletal, followed by the upper, stories of warehouses whose windows glimmered faintly with lantern light. The shoreline remained hidden longest, as if London itself were reluctant to reveal its full shape, rising slowly from sleep rather than announcing its presence all at once. In winter, the cold sharpened everything. Breath smoked in the air. Ropes stiffened. Fingers numbed before the day had properly begun. This river fed the city, not metaphorically, but physically. Coal arrived from the north, stacked black and shining with frost. Grain came in sacks that smelled of damp fields and distant summers. Timber drifted downstream in long trains, their surfaces scarred by axes and travel. Sugar, tea, tobacco, rum, and spices arrived sealed in barrels, carrying the warmth of other climates into the gray heart of London. By water these goods came, and by water they were distributed, parceled out into a city that consumed endlessly and asked little about the hands that supplied it. Along the Pool of London, the river narrowed under pressure. Wharves were packed tight, pressed against one another with no wasted space, as if every inch of shoreline had been argued over and claimed. Warehouses rose high and narrow, their brick faces darkened by damp and smoke, their windows small and barred. Many leaned slightly, the result of hurried construction and shifting ground, but they stood nonetheless, reinforced by necessity. Cranes groaned as they lifted cargo, their wooden arms creaking under strain, rigging cutting sharp lines against the pale winter light. Chains rattled, hooks clanged, and barrels thudded into place with dull finality. Dock workers moved in disciplined lines, passing sacks and casks hand to hand, their movements practiced and economical. Their labor was loud without being spoken, a language of effort understood by anyone who had ever worked near the river. Shoulders braced, backs bent, boots slipping on wet planks. They rarely looked up. This was the working heart of the British economy, though the men carrying the weight rarely thought beyond the next load, the next wage, the next chance to warm their hands. Their world was measured in aches, in time between meals, in the hope that injury would not come today. At river level, life was immediate and dangerous. Watermen waited at the stone stairs that descended directly into the Thames, steadying their boats as passengers made their cautious way down, cloaks snapping in the wind. These men knew every current, every hidden obstruction, every mood of the tide. They shouted fares that echoed between buildings, voices roughened by cold and long hours. Barges crowded the water, nudging into quays, their hulls scraping timber, crews shouting warnings that blurred together in the fog. A mistake here could mean crushed fingers, broken bones, or a fall into water so cold it stole breath before it stole life. London accepted these risks as the price of movement. The river was not only a place of work, but of constant negotiation. Tides governed schedules more firmly than any clock. A delayed cargo could spoil. A missed tide could strand a vessel for hours. Winter ice sometimes formed along the edges, complicating landings and slowing traffic. In harsher years, The river froze thick enough to bear weight, turning briefly into a strange carnival of booths and fires. But those moments were remembered precisely because they were rare and unsettling. The Thames was meant to move. When it stopped, London felt uneasy, as if its pulse had faltered. On the docks, history revealed itself in details rather than declarations. Tarred ropes slid across cracked hands, knots pulled tight around posts worn smooth by decades of use. Lantern light caught the fibers, warm and golden against the gray morning. The smell of pitch, wet wood, and coal smoke hung heavy in the air, settling into clothes and hair. Nearby, muddy lanes carried wagons inland, their ruts deep and frozen, horses strained forward, muscles trembling beneath patched harnesses, steam rising from their bodies as drivers shouted and cracked whips. Iron rims clattered over stone, splashing through puddles that reflected leaning walls and sagging timbers. These lanes were arteries, feeding the city's interior. Goods moved slowly at first, bottlenecked by congestion and poor surfaces, then faster as streets widened and paving improved. Shops opened their shutters as light strengthened, revealing counters crowded with wares. Bakers unloaded flour, brewers hauled barrels, shopkeepers swept thresholds already dirty again by passing boots. London did not pause to admire itself. It consumed, discarded, rebuilt, and moved on. Above this chaos rose symbols of order and ambition. Dense rooftops pressed together until the skyline opened to reveal church spires, their stone pale against the low clouds. Beyond them rose the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, immense and steady. Rebuilt after fire and disaster, it stood as a reminder of endurance, authority, and the possibility of control. Smoke drifted across it in slow ribbons, softening its edges. Bells were implied rather than heard, marking time for a population that rarely paused to listen. London was constantly rebuilding. Scaffolds clung to roofs. Streets shifted shape as necessity demanded. Old alleys vanished, new ones appeared, and maps struggled to keep up. The rebuilding was rarely elegant. It was driven by fire, by collapse, by profit. Wooden structures gave way to brick and stone, not out of aesthetic preference, but because disaster had made alternatives unacceptable. Regulations followed catastrophe, then slowly loosened as memory faded. Builders worked fast, cutting corners where they could, trusting that the future would deal with the consequences. In this way, the city layered itself, each generation building atop the last, often unaware of what lay beneath their feet. Westward, the city changed character almost imperceptibly at first, then decisively. Near Westminster, stone buildings and wide approaches reflected political power and administrative purpose. Here the river felt calmer, its banks more controlled. Clerks, porters, soldiers, and officials crossed paths near the water before separating into ordered lives. Papers moved as steadily as goods. Decisions made in quiet rooms traveled outward, shaping lives far removed from their authors. Bridges carried carts and people across the Thames, reshaping movement and trade. Each new bridge altered the city's flow, binding once distant districts closer together and accelerating growth. Where ferries once dominated, fixed crossings imposed new rhythms. Tolls collected coins and resentment in equal measure. Bridges became places of meeting and conflict, of commerce and spectacle. From them, Londoners could look down at the river and see their city reflected in motion. With growth came control, or at least the attempt at it. Administration spread through paper and ink. Ledgers recorded goods and taxes, names and fines, births and deaths. Quills scratched beneath candlelight, their sound steady and patient. Clerks bent over desks in cramped offices, eyes strained by poor light, hands stained black. Mistakes were costly, omissions dangerous. On streets like Bow Street, guarded doorways signaled authority. Messengers carried documents that could imprison or release, ruin or restore. London's justice was public and visible, woven into daily life rather than hidden from it. Watchmen patrolled at night with lanterns and cudgels, calling the hour in voices meant to reassure as much as to warn. Their shadows stretched across wet cobbles, distorted by uneven stone and flickering light. Crime followed opportunity, especially along the river. Ships moored for the night were tempting targets, their cargoes vulnerable to quick hands and quicker escapes. Thieves learned the tides as well as watermen did. Some worked alone, others in loose networks, moving goods through taverns, alleys, and markets before daylight exposed them. Punishment, when it came, was meant to be seen. It traveled outward from the courts, into the streets, into memory. Roads toward Tyburn filled on execution days, carts creaking beneath vendors and spectators drawn by fear, curiosity, and something harder to name. The gallows stood stark against pale skies, soldiers struggling to hold back pressing crowds. Children were lifted onto shoulders for a better view. Prayers mixed with jokes. The moment of death was brief, but the waiting stretched long. Outside Newgate Prison, rain slicked the ground as crowds gathered for glimpses of the condemned. Inside, iron and stone confined life to breath and silence, where overcrowding and disease erased any sense of time. Punishment was public and harsh, turning justice into spectacle and fear into instruction. Beneath this brutality, new systems were taking shape. Officials studied crime along the Thames, mapping docks and warehouses and shifting focus from punishment to prevention. Order was becoming organized rather than personal. Coffee houses spread ideas quickly. Merchants, writers, and politicians debated over newspapers and bitter coffee, while print shops filled the city with pamphlets that carried opinions beyond control. Words became a new form of power. London expanded relentlessly. Planned neighborhoods rose in the west, with wide streets and uniform terraces reflecting wealth and order. In the east, crowded workshops and docks remained loud and labor-driven, filled with workers and sailors from across the world. Reform followed necessity. Streets were paved, drains cut, lamps installed, and houses numbered. Shop windows displayed goods openly, turning consumption into part of daily life. Pleasure and hardship existed side by side. Gin shops offered escape, reformers warned of decay, and charities struggled to ease suffering. Medicine advanced unevenly, mixing progress with fear. Politics remained unstable. Rumors sparked protests and riots, reminding the city how fragile order could be. By century's end, London was larger and more confident, but still unequal. Poverty endured, labor remained harsh, and the Thames continued to set the rhythm of life. The city was no longer merely surviving. It was becoming modern.